We're talking over the issues of the day with our leaders panel, William Hague and Kezia Dugdale. William Hague, you have a column in the paper today, Johnson Will Have to Change If He's to Survive, where you really display the scars of having to defend a whole list of Tory leaders in the past. Where does Boris Johnson rank in terms of leaders it's difficult to defend?
He's the most difficult to defend. That's the point of my column. Really, I feel I've defended, almost impossible situations as I set out in that column. Theresa May, when really everything was voted down in Parliament, or Ian Duncan Smith, and everybody was going at him. And I've still stood by them. And I explain in my column why, on the whole, I think it's a good thing for a democracy that political parties stick together and former leaders stick by each other and so on. But I'm saying Boris is the hardest to defend, and that's partly because he does some things that are very difficult or impossible to defend, the whole Partygate business. And secondly, because he gives conflicting signals. And the point really I'm making is that that's what's really undermining him. If you say in the House of Commons, I'm really, really, really sorry, but then you say afterwards, oh, really, this is all about nothing. Well, then you give out signals that people get very worried about, and that's why more MPs have moved against him. So, there were some ominous signs for him last week. Very ominous signs.
But William, is that not all politicians do? They tell one thing to a whole group of people, and another thing to another group of people. That's just the nature of politics, isn't it? That you try and please the audience that you're talking to.
Well, while that, to some extent, of course, you talk about whatever that audience is most interested in. But I give the example in my column of Margaret Thatcher. I've been around so long. I was an MP when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister. And she used to really belt out her arguments and her statistics in the House of Commons. Then you'd have this terrifying experience afterwards if you sat in the House of Commons tea room. That Margaret Thatcher would walk in, there would be this awful moment where the handbag would plonk down next to you, and you'd turn around, oh my God, it's the Prime Minister. And she would sit there and she'd give you the same thing. The next 15 minutes was, I hope you were listening there in the House of Commons. And then she'd go over it all at greater length. So you were in no doubt whatsoever, oh boy, she really means it. And she was like that about everything. So whether you loved her or hated her, you absolutely, there was no, I'm going to say behind the scenes, something different from in the House of Commons. And I'm just pointing out that's one of the ways where Boris is coming unstuck at the moment.
Kezia, another way of talking about that is perhaps that Margaret Thatcher had an ideology, and maybe great prime ministers or prime ministers that you can, Blair's another good example, had a clear ideology. And therefore, if you supported the person, you supported the ideology and vice versa. Is maybe Boris Johnson's problem now is he doesn't have an ideology. He was a winner. He was someone who tried to pick the best opportunity, famously writing a column for Brexit and against it. And if you don't stand for something, then when things get shaky for you, there's not really a great reason to support you.
Well, 2 points on that. I think you're crediting some people with an ideology who didn't really have it. Tony Blair's ideology was to be in power himself, and for it not to be Gordon Brown when he was in power. But when it comes to Boris, there is an ideology, I suppose, there is of Brexit, of now making the most of the opportunities of Brexit. But that really has to work. Now that has to be really delivered. And people have to really be able to see the benefit of that. So I think he has an ideology, but he's only got a couple of years to show, or the government has a couple of years before an election to show that really works for people.
Kezia?
I think his ideology is winning, which is also his weakest point, because the minute that his backbenchers decided that he's no longer a winner, he's in deep trouble. And I think that's what's so interesting about the contrast you're seeing just now around Partygate and the cost of living crisis. So I've never really thought, as angry as I am about it, that Partygate would be the end of Boris Johnson, because I study what the public think about their politicians, and I'm afraid the public hold them in such low regard that they're not particularly surprised when politicians break the rules. So they can be very angry about it, but it might not change the decisions that they take at the ballot box. That, combined with the reality of which local authorities are actually up for election across the whole of England, suggests to me that the Conservatives are going to have a pretty decent local set of elections, which isn't going to increase the political terror that he faces from his own side. I think what's far more of a threat to him is if he's seen not to be rising to the challenge of the cost of living crisis that he's faced with, or the country is faced with. And that could be keenly felt in the north of England. And it could be those MPs that ultimately decide that he's no longer the winner that he once was.
We talk about the rise and fall of politicians' popularity, and Rishi Sunak, once leading Conservative voters, is now at the bottom of the poll in Conservative home. And I was asking listeners to say who they think is best at answering questions when they come on this show and who they like, therefore, the most. I've got to say that Ben Wallace is doing the best, it seems to me. Not a politician, just a decent human being, which is what we need. Grant Shapps has a little bit here as well, but Ben Wallace is definitely in the lead, I think, at the moment. Who do you think is good at it, Kezia? Who's good at answering questions, who you listen to and you think, whether or not I agree with the politics, I find that person plausible?
Oh, when you threw plausible at the end of that sentence, that was a bit of a sidewinder. I like both of those individuals that you've just mentioned. I mean, I think Ben Wallace is doing a very strong job right now, not just of taking the right decisions, but communicating why Britain is doing what it's doing in Ukraine. There's no doubt he deserves credit for that. But equally, I think Grant Shapps is absolutely the kind of person that you want to send out on a difficult morning media round. And there's no doubt that the government have had a number of those in recent days. Whether he's actually answering the questions, I think, is for you to decide rather than me, Stig.
Well, G has said, could I nominate Grant Shapps for not answering questions while sounding like he is, which I think is a great skill.
That's a skill.
William, who do you think's been good?
Actually, I'm with the listeners. I'm not just crawling to the listeners. I think that's true. Ben Wallace, absolutely, is doing a very good job, and really you can tell when he answers the question, he's on top of that job and really cares about the job and isn't just, reciting the statistics and so on. But to be fair across the aisle, to choose somebody from the Labour Party, I think Wes Streeting is a bit of a star on the Labour side. So let's get him on Times Radio more.
Oh, he's on quite a lot, actually. I have to say, and quite often it doesn't always seem to be on message, which is always nice. We're going to briefly talk about Twitter because we've mentioned it a lot this morning. Twitter is soon to be in the hands of the world's richest man. I'm sure you all know Elon Musk, of course, with a $44 billion takeover deal. Musk has said that he hopes his worst critics, that's not just Stig, but other people, would remain on the platform. Please stay, stressing that free speech is the bedrock of a functioning democracy. Kezia Dugdale, do you have any concerns about Elon Musk owning Twitter?
I'm a bit worried about what his definition of free speech might be, because it's presented sometimes as if it's an absolute right, which of course it's not, because people like Donald Trump have been kicked off Twitter from using that free speech to incite riots. Now, if he takes a slightly different view and then invites people like that back onto the platform, then I think we've got a real problem of having such a powerful communication force without any moderation whatsoever. Could lead us into really dangerous territory when we're already faced with the damage that the global populism that we're faced with just now actually does. So it depends.
William, what would you add to that?
Social media is a disaster for democracy.
Oh.
And we would be much better off if the whole lot could be shut down.
Oh, William.
I know that there are many benefits to it, but it could be organized in a different way if it can't be shut down. At the moment, the uninformed, ignorant, instant opinion is ranked equally alongside a considered opinion or debated opinion. And that's deeply unhealthy for democracy. There'll be even more of that if Donald Trump is back on Twitter in the light of this. And I would like to see very radical global regulation. It's very hard to do of social media, where you can see the original source of any information, including if it came from Russia, for instance, where the algorithms they choose for news feeds are transparent and published. Where you have to have a cooling off period before you can respond to anything on Twitter, and where the posts on social media don't have a maximum size, they should have a minimum size, so that you have to explain your argument. And if we did all that, we'd have a healthier democracy. And Twitter, I admit, would only be worth about what 1/10 of what it is.
Well, listen, there's a lot of.
He takes the risk that somebody like me will come along and regulate it properly.
Now, there's a lot of truth in what you say. However, if it's such a disaster for democracy, why are you on Twitter?
Well, I only use it.
I know you don't reply to anyone. I've
I
been
don't
looking.
reply
You
to
just
anybody.
post your amazing
I've
columns.
just put out my the title of my Times column. I did use it in its early days as when I was Foreign Secretary to actually answer people's questions from around the world. Now that is I thought that was a constructive use of social media, that somebody in the middle of India could ask me a question live for the British Foreign Secretary, and I did regular sessions like that. Now that is using social media to extend debate. But usually it is used just to assert something that may or may not be true. And that's why it needs reform. Trouble is, which government's going to reform it? Unless the United States led the way in doing this, of course, the rest of the world can't really do it.
Kezia, do you hate yourself when you're on Twitter? If someone closed down Twitter, I think my life would get better.
Hate yourself.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, it is 90% bin fire, I think, but I'm still hanging on for the 10% good that comes from it. And there is some kind of organising or a natural alignment of communities that otherwise wouldn't find each other or come together that Twitter provides. But it's a pretty angry space, and it increasingly so on issues like trans rights, which I just find utterly depressing. It's adding nothing to that.
I'll tell you what's quite good. Book Twitter can be really good, because when you suddenly say, I like Dorothy Sayers, you'll find loads of people saying, I really like Dorothy Sayers, and that's really nice.
But less of people who tweet photographs of a pile of 10 books and say, I read them last week. They're annoying.
They are annoying.
It's not a competition.
No, and they're obviously annoying as well. They probably know in their heart of hearts that they're annoying. Last story of the day, spiking someone's drink is a heinous crime. That should be a criminal offence, according to MPs in the Home Affairs Select Committee. The report calls for more robust evidence, stating that no one knows how prevalent spiking is, whether by drink, drug, or the needle. This comes at a time when misogyny in Parliament is rife. A Mail on Sunday piece has quoted unnamed Conservative MP accused Labour Deputy Leader Angela Rayner. This is a boringly awful story of crossing and uncrossing her legs to distract the Prime Minister in the dispatch box. Kezia, I wonder, there's lots of issues there which we probably now have time to unpick, but on the latter point, is that a bit of a weird distraction that some simple-minded Tory MP briefed a Mail on Sunday journalist and they overcooked the story with pictures? That's one thing. But this idea that there's 56 MPs, and your Times column talks about this, 56 MPs facing sexual harassment investigations in the House of Commons, that's something we should be talking about more rather than Angela Rayner's legs.
Yes, but the two things are linked. So the fact that MPs feel like they can make remarks like that about Angela Rayner, it creates enabling culture whereby people with power will abuse it. And people that don't have the voice and agency of Angela Rayner are probably suffering in the House of Commons just now by all the lechy MPs or senior staffers that are leaning over doorways, perching on desks, saying inappropriate comments, talking about what they're wearing. I think it's an endemic problem, but I also don't think it's one that women alone should be required to fix, even though they're the highest possible or recent levels of representation in Parliament. I think we need all these thoroughly modern men to actually take some serious action about this political culture, and inaction, in my view, is now culpability.
And did it happen? Were you aware of it? Did you see stuff when you were in politics that was just that low hum of abuse?
Absolutely, every single day. And I also spoke to many men across political parties in the Scottish Parliament at the time who didn't see it, who couldn't see it. And it actually took an investigation by the Parliament itself a few years ago and a survey of all the staff within the building to prove that 30% of the women in the building had experienced some form of sexual harassment at some time, for those modern male leaders to wake up and realise that there was a problem there, even if they weren't directly a part of it.
Williams, is it down to people like you, you're no longer in Parliament, when you were, all men listening to this, that when you see someone acting inappropriately, to say something about it?
Yeah, I agree with everything Kezia has said. And men are 99% of the problem. So they have to be a very large part of the solution. That is absolutely right. I think I should point out, though, the men who do this don't reveal it very easily to the other men who don't. They're quite good at disguising it, I think. So it's not as easy to, if you're the leader of the party, like I was talking to the chief whip every day about people, of course you come across some really bad cases and you want to deal with them. But you wouldn't be aware. Most people who are doing whatever they're doing are not doing it in front of the leader of the party. So it needs people to be able to report without fear what is happening. Maybe that's what we're now beginning to see.
Yeah, 3 members of the cabinet, 2 members of the shadow cabinet currently under investigation for sexual impropriety in some form or another. We'll have to see what happens to those cases wherever we find out about them. Great to speak to you as ever. Fascinating stuff. That was Kezia Dugdale, former Scottish Labour leader. She writes in the Times, as does William Hague, who's the former leader of the Conservative Party, of course.